given the rise or a proposed rise in fees, how can you guarantee that education will remain or indeed increase accessibility for a range of people?
I'll take that to John first.
Right. Well, first of all, I wouldn't necessarily accept your premise that there is absolutely going to be a rise in fees. Okay. I think what there's going to be is a substantial change to the whole graduate contribution and student support framework. And I think it's important to understand that it's the totality of that that's going to be looked at. And I know that some parts of the university sector are arguing for an increase in what you would see as fees. I think it's a much more complex argument than that. I think, let me just start by saying that the present system is unjust. It actually, if you work through it, it's the working classes that don't access higher education who are funding some of the middle classes to benefit from student loans that they actually don't need. So there is an inequality in the scheme at present, and there is also, and it's exactly the point that was made, that those institutions that open their doors to wider participation are expected to make a greater contribution through the university. So I absolutely agree with the N.U.S. on this, that actually we'd be far better to work to a national scheme which was fairer and more equitable. I think the issue is actually rather that if you reduced fees, which one of the political parties would like to do, that actually does have an impact upon participation rate, because the overall budget has to balance, and it would simply mean there will be less higher education and less opportunity. I think we need to look below your question at the relationship between, well, first of all, there's a principle that it should be free at the point of delivery, so that actually your ability to go to university should not be impeded by whatever the cost is. Secondly, it shouldn't be determined by your family's income. In other words, it should be actually about you, your intellectual ability, not your postcode, not your social class. So whatever principle we have, that should be absolutely central to it. And thirdly, if it is a contribution scheme where the student and the graduate is making a contribution, that's got to be structured in a way that it doesn't disadvantage particular social groups. In other words, if you think, because of my social group or my background or my disability, actually I'm not going to be a high earning graduate. I'm going to be a decent graduate doing good work but maybe committed to equality and community work and so on, and I'm not going to be a high payer. That fact, which then you think, oh gosh, and will I ever be able to pay off my student loan? That's not got to be a barrier to your entry. So you have to have a scheme that says, if people rightly want to enter the church as a, and have to be a very low paid vocational job, or there are lots of professions that are completely legitimate but not well paid, we've got to make sure that they're not disadvantaged. So it's really not simple, and I can't give you a guarantee other than say this university works pretty hard to try to make sure that we don't disadvantage any group of students unintentionally, although it does happen.
Unfortunately, we're going to agree on quite a lot this evening. It would be more interesting if we were sat here with somebody from the Russell Group, which is the 20 institutions that are most research intensive, one of which I went to. So I went to Leeds, and the Vice Chancellor at Leeds chairs the Russell Group. And the Russell Group have kind of long been presented as the area of the university sector which would like to see that cap removed, would like to see fee rates of potentially 5,000, 7,000 or unlimited amounts, where institutions could decide what it charged, where it could position itself within a market, and that other institutions may choose not to do that for other reasons, or other institutions may not be able to do so. We're seriously concerned, N.U.S, about the prospect of the removal of the cap and a true market emerging within higher education, because of some of the reasons that have already been outlined, because of the fact that we believe a true market would mean that students would be making their choices based on the cost, not on what they wanted to study or where they wanted to study. We believe it would disadvantage those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds from accessing education, and we would be concerned about how quality would be assessed within that market. Like, is an institution that charges 7,000 more a better institution than an institution that chooses to charge 3,000 or 4,000? The kind of relatively healthy investment that universities have seen over the last 10 to 12 years is not going to continue, and students' experience is inevitably going to be impacted by any such cuts. and we're concerned about where that will fall. And will it be research that sees cuts, or will it be contact time? Will it, not that research isn't beneficial to students as well, but what is there going to be available for students? On the second, I'll just say the second point quickly.
Shall we come back to the second point afterwards? I'll go across to John.
On cuts. Well, first let me start with your point that actually we have seen, as a combination of government investment under New Labour and the variable fees, a growth of income of about 8% per annum over the past decade. And associated with that, we've seen growth in student numbers and participation rate as that has gradually grown. So the average unit of resource per student has remained more or less steady, but we've seen a growth, and our expenditure has grown by slightly more than the increase in public funding, because universities have attracted more funding from international students and from third stream. So it's more or less on balance, but it has been a decade or more of plenty in higher education. Let's be clear about that. Prior to that, before many of you were even at school, we had a series of cuts under a previous Conservative government, which saw a 20% reduction, approaching 30% in the unit of resource. And that was quite frightening. I wasn't involved in management at that time, but nevertheless I experienced it. In terms of how what's happening now, you know that our public borrowing has reached £178 billion, which is 12% of our GDP. Greece is at 12.7% and seem to be in meltdown. So you can see how close we are. What has actually happened is that government has announced, and it's a rather bizarre way that they've announced it, but about 12% reduction in funding over 9-10, which was an in-year reduction, 10-11 and 11-12. This is the so-called 900 million that's been taken out of higher education. Because it's a soft touch, because it doesn't lose votes as you come into a general election. And actually there's been no public outcry, there's been no reduction, no reaction from the students, no reaction from the Students' Union. I mean, it's been a silent cut. Beyond that, what we fear, and I have to say this is just fear, is that we know that the Conservatives are looking to make a 6.8% per annum reduction in public spend over the next 3 years. That will be a devastating reduction. And actually what share of that we would be expected to make, it probably will be the full amount. That will be a very serious and difficult to manage situation. So far, it's resulted in a steady state, non-inflationary lifted budget of, for us, about a 1% reduction. So it's manageable in 9, 10 and 10, 11. It gets very tough in 11, 12. Post the general election, it becomes unbelievably difficult to imagine how we'll cope in 11, 12 beyond. I mean, my view is, we agree on a lot, but I disagree that it should be a tax, because I don't think any government has ever managed to maintain that strict relationship between tax and where it will be spent. It's just politically too difficult. So our advice, when I say our, this is Universities UK have considered this and come to the same conclusion broadly, that a student contribution would be the way to, I think, handle this, which is fair and it isn't socially divisive in the way that we currently have, but it is still based upon a notional loan with a real interest rate, because at the moment the government can't sustain the student loan. That's the big problem. And I think if we could persuade them to fund it at the level at which they borrow money, in other words at around 2%, then I think it becomes an achievable cost to students going forward. And you've then got the advantage that they're paying for their own education. This idea of intercalation, so that one group of students are paying for the next group of students' education, I can see politically it's a very nice argument, but sorry, from an N.U.S. political argument, but I think the national politicians will be too tempted to rob Peter, because it's always an annual debate about health, education, defence, and you know those debates are rough and tough, and I don't think saying, oh, we made a commitment to the Students' Union is going to hold much water. So that's my worry about that, Rob, actually. I'm just not sure that it's politically robust enough.